Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my top 50 flex rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're going to be talking about all four primary positions, whether it be quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end, as I'll present statistics and data that I've collected this offseason in order to justify their current rankings. Now, as I individually reveal every single player, that is the order in which I would draft them going into my 2023 fantasy football leagues. All statistics and data that I present over the course of today's episode is for a half PPR scoring format, so keep that in mind, meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league. Now, the final reminder in regards to today's rankings is the fact that rankings are subject to change. As of the current recording of this video, I'm still waiting an hour to see whether or not Jonathan Taylor gets traded or potentially gets placed on the PUP list for the Indianapolis Colts, which would force him to miss the first 4 games minimum for the 2023 year, which would absolutely impact his overall fantasy standing and ranking. Therefore, if you're trying to stay up to date on my latest content, all things fantasy football related for the entirety of the 2023 season, be sure to subscribe today. Again, we're making daily fantasy football content for the singular purpose of trying to help you win a fantasy football championship, whether it's via the draft or whether it's the regular season and beyond, trying to capture a championship. Additionally, for those of you who want even more advantages this offseason, be sure to travel down to the description of the video. Besides subscribing, check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get a first-time deposit match up to $100, you're additionally going to get my 2023 fantasy football draft guide, the rankings that come with that draft guide updated every week over the entire month of August. So regardless of when you're drafting, you have an advantage upon your league mates. Additionally, this draft guide contains hundreds of hours of knowledge and statistics that I've put together in order to identify my methodology as to how I approach every position and how I find success in my 2023 fantasy football drafts. Additionally, besides the draft guide, the rankings that you'll get over the course of this month, you'll also get rankings every single Sunday morning from weeks 1 through 18 of the 2023 season, which is by tier, by position, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defense, top 200 flex. On top of it, you'll get flex rankings, half PPR, full PPR, 4-point per passing touchdown, 6-point per passing touchdown. All of that included for the entirety of the 2023 season. All you got to do today, sign up using code Andrew. Make that first-time deposit minimum of $10. For those of you wondering if you're eligible, check out the map to the left side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your location and start drafting today via Underdog Fantasy responsibly. Thank you very much. The last thing I want to mention before we get into my top 50 flex rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season, almost a tongue twister there. A reminder, the Andrew Kirchhoff official merchandise line, the 1.01 brand, is now available. You can check out the link down in the description of the video, and you can go ahead and wrap greetings and salutations similar to the way that I am currently on screen with this hoodie, or you could potentially check out the tie-dye hoodies on screen. Those are in limited capacity, so first come, first serve. Get them before they're all gone. Thank you very much for supporting the channel. Again, the entire purpose of this merchandise line is to provide high-quality, comfortable, stylish clothing for your most stressful of upcoming fantasy football Sundays, so be sure to check it out below. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about my top 50 flex players for the 2023 fantasy football season, the order in which I would draft these players. Now, for those of you who are looking for me to talk about these players for an extended rate, 2 to 3 minutes, again, I've talked about all of these players already on today's video ad nauseum in the last couple of days in regards to my top 50 running backs, wide receivers, top 30 tight ends, and top 32 quarterbacks. So if you want to hear me talk about Jalen Hurts, TJ Hawkinson, Austin Ekeler, Christian Watson for 2 to 3 minutes a pop, be sure to go check out those videos. This overall statistics that I'm going to present in terms of talking about these players are going to be brief. Therefore, we can get through all 50 of these players without it taking an hour long. So let's get into talking about the number one player, the first player on the S here. It is Justin Jefferson. Justin Jefferson, I believe, is going to be the Triple Crown winner in 2023. We saw Cooper Kupp accomplish it in 2021. In order to win the Triple Crown, you have to lead your position, the wide receiver position, in receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Luckily for Justin Jefferson, he was able to lead the wide receiver position last season in targets, receptions, and receiving yards. The only thing that eluded him was receiving touchdowns. But luckily for him, he had the opportunity, and hopefully if that opportunity continues in 2023, he'll be able to capture that Triple Crown. Last season was number 2 amongst all receiving options, only behind Travis Kelce in terms of red zone targets, and was number 1 amongst all receiving targets in red zone targets inside the 10-yard line. With Adam Thielen gone, a receiver that has had 30 receiving touchdowns, 25 in the red zone over the course of the last 3 seasons, Justin Jefferson absolutely should be able to capture the Triple Crown and be the number 1 overall fantasy prospect. Moving on to Christian McCaffrey, the only other player in the S tier. Christian McCaffrey, as soon as he was traded to the San Francisco 49ers, for the remainder of the season, from week 7 through 18, was the number 1 overall running back in fantasy football, averaging over 20 fantasy points per game. Again, with Brock Purdy in games in which Christian McCaffrey played 50% or more of the offensive snaps, was averaging 21.73 half PPR fantasy points per game. I know there's a narrative about whether or not Elijah Mitchell is going to be digging into his work. Even if Elijah Mitchell is there, the fact of the matter is Christian McCaffrey is a complementary player. He needs to have a talented team around him so that they can move him around, whether it's in the slot, whether it's out of the backfield, whether it's out wide, so he can slice up defenses and dominate for fantasy purposes. Moving on, let's talk about Ja'Marr Chase beginning the A tier. Ja'Marr Chase, again, last season, 11.17 targets per game, 16.58 fantasy points per game in the 12 healthy games he played for the organization. Obviously missed an extended amount of time, went to the IR because of that injury, but if we're going to potentially see Ja'Marr Chase, similar to his former college teammate Justin Jefferson, make that year 3 jump, potentially Ja'Marr Chase could get himself into the conversation of being an S-tier player, because just imagine what that jump would look like when he's already averaging over 11 targets per game last year and 16.5 fantasy points per game. If he makes that jump, he'll be an absolute S-tier player within this upcoming season. Moving on. Let's talk about Cooper Kupp. The only reason Cooper Kupp is sitting in the A tier is because there is some fear as to whether or not his hamstring injury is going to plague him for this year and whether or not Matthew Stafford could stay healthy. Outside of those variables, Cooper Kupp is the best fantasy football wide receiver over the course of the last 2 seasons. Again, in the last 2 years, including the NFL playoffs, he has averaged 21.67 fantasy points per game in the last 29 games he has played. If you want to just go ahead and isolate in 2022, from weeks 1 through 9, prior to his injury, he was averaging 20.31 fantasy points per game, was the number 1 overall receiver in fantasy, and was unstoppable. And hopefully will be healthy and ready to go for the entirety of this season at that rate. If he is, he might end up being the best overall player for fantasy purposes. Moving on, let's talk about Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill, despite the fact that he went from Patrick Mahomes to Tua Tagovailoa, improved. Set career highs in a boatload of statistics, specifically targets, receptions, and receiving yards. Pretty ridiculous. Nonetheless, when you go into this upcoming year, we're expecting a full healthy Tua, 17 games. And if that's going to be the case, just taking the account of games from 2022 in which Tua was healthy, 10 of those different contests with Tyreek Hill in the lineup, Tyreek Hill was averaging 20 fantasy points per game. We're hoping for that kind of upside in 2023. Moving on to Austin Ekeler. Austin Ekeler, again, the fact that he has scored 38 total touchdowns in the last 33 games that he has played, obviously averaging 19 fantasy points per game, and there is no backfield competition within this offense. He's not only able to get it done on the ground, in the red zone, but through the air. Of course, last season had 107 receptions. He's probably not going to reach that number, but nonetheless has so much upside within this offense and is just a dynamic player similar to Christian McCaffrey. Moving on to the final running back and the final player of the A tier, we're talking about Bijan Robinson, the rookie running back out of Texas. Again, when we look at the history of the running back position, specifically running backs who were selected in the first 8 picks of their overall NFL draft, since 2013, the last decade, we've seen Saquon Barkley, Leonard Fournette, Ezekiel Elliott, and of course, Christian McCaffrey list in that category. Those running backs in their rookie seasons averaged 260 plus fantasy points over the course of their rookie seasons. And those were all in seasons in which they were playing 16 games rather than 17 in this overall conversation. Behind an elite offensive line with an offensive coordinator / head coach that want to continue to run the ball, Bijan Robinson should be in a perfect situation for success. Moving on, let's talk about Nick Chubb to begin the B tier. Nick Chubb, considering the fact that there is no more backfield competition with Kareem Hunt and D'Ernest Johnson, I know they just made a trade for Pierre Strong. I don't expect Pierre Strong to be a huge workload running back within this offense. He could barely get reps within the New England Patriots offense when they desperately needed him to get into the rotation when Damian Harris was hurt. So going into this upcoming year, when Nick Chubb, over the course of the last 3 seasons, has been given 50% or more of the offensive snaps, the guy's averaging 19.5 touches per game and 17.25 fantasy points per game. With receiving upside unlocked, Nick Chubb should be unstoppable. Moving on to Travis Kelce. Considering he's been the number 1 overall tight end in fantasy football in 6 out of the last 7 seasons, and the fact that typically, when you're looking for a positional advantage in the first round, you can find one with Travis Kelce, considering 2 out of the last 3 seasons have consisted of 260 or more fantasy points. In the last 3 years, averaging over 15.5 fantasy points per game with Patrick Mahomes in the lineup during the regular season. In the playoffs, Travis Kelce is an even better player, but overall, we're talking about consistency of play and the fact that he's never missed a game due to injury since 2013. Travis Kelce, an automatic first-round selection. Moving on, let's talk about Derrick Henry. Even though many people are sleeping on Derrick Henry, they say, he's 29 years old. He's had a boatload of touches over his career. He's built differently. He is not a normal human. Derrick Henry is a special human, and we all know that. We've seen him rank as the number 3, the number 2, and the number 4 overall running back in the last 3 healthy seasons. In 2021, when he wasn't healthy, prior to his season-ending injury, the guy was the number 1 overall running back in fantasy football by a long shot. Jonathan Taylor would not have ranked as number 1 overall in that year if Derrick Henry had stayed healthy. Over the course of the last 4 seasons with Ryan Tannehill under center, he's averaging over 20 fantasy points per game. That's the level of contribution I expect to see once again from Derrick Henry. Let's move on to the C tier. We begin with Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard, in the last 4 seasons of his career, obviously has been plagued with the idea that Ezekiel Elliott has been the primary target getter and additionally the primary rusher of this offense, specifically down in the red zone. But with that now gone, with no Ezekiel Elliott and no other backfield competition, there is so much potential for Tony Pollard to reach a top 5 running back standing. In his career, any games he's played with 50% or more of the offensive snaps, he's averaging 18.16 fantasy points per game. In the 3 games in which Ezekiel Elliott throughout Tony Pollard's career has missed due to injury, Tony Pollard is averaging 27.23 fantasy points per game. There's no backfield competition. No one's taking away the goal line carries. This is an offense that quite literally gave the ball to Ezekiel Elliott the 5th most times inside the 5-yard line that led to 9 rushing touchdowns. If those go in the direction of Tony Pollard, my goodness, he's going to be an unstoppable fantasy prospect. Moving on, let's talk about Stefon Diggs. When we want to talk about consistency at the wide receiver position and someone that you can absolutely rely upon, considering the quarterback that he's associated with, Josh Allen, putting up 4,200 passing yards and 35 passing touchdowns each of the last 3 seasons, and the fact that since Stefon Diggs has joined this offense, he's finished and ranked as wide receiver 3, 7, and 4.5 PPR scoring format. That's the kind of consistency we want in a pass-first offense going into 2023. Moving on to Saquon Barkley. Last season, Saquon Barkley handled 76% of the running back opportunities in this backfield. That's a combination of both targets and rushing attempts. In the last 5 seasons, since 2018, there have been 11 running backs, including Saquon Barkley, who have been able to command 70% or more of their backfield's opportunities within a given season. 10 of those 11 running backs were top 7 in their season. I expect Saquon Barkley, currently have him ranked as my 7th running back, to be a great fantasy option for 2023. Moving on, let's talk about CeeDee Lamb. CeeDee Lamb, with a full healthy season of Dak Prescott, will be significantly better than the numbers that he put up last year, because we have to remember, from week 7 through the NFL playoffs, with Dak Prescott under center, CeeDee Lamb was averaging 16.1 fantasy points per game. He primarily plays out of the slot position. He's going to be targeted over 150 times once again, if not more, considering the target vacancy within this offense of 195 targets missing, considering Zeke's absence, Dalton Schultz, Noah Brown, and T.Y. Hilton. I expect this offense to continue to look towards their number 1 receiver, CeeDee Lamb. Let's move on to Josh Jacobs. Again, most recently signed with this team. I'm expecting regression in comparison to what we saw last season from Josh Jacobs, considering there's going to be a little bit less comfortability with the change at quarterback and where they're trending going forward. But again, in order for Josh Jacobs to be able to put up similar numbers to last season, you got to remember, he had 2,000 all-purpose yards, he had over 50 receptions and 12 touchdowns. Those numbers are very difficult to repeat, especially coming off of a season in which he had 390 touches out of this backfield. Every single season of Josh Jacobs' career, whether it's before or after an injury, he's always been on pace for being an RB1. 2019, prior to the injury, RB11. 2020, with no injury, RB8. 2021, after the injury, RB7. And last season was RB3. He's going to be an RB1. That's a given. I'm just expecting regression as to the incredible numbers that he put up last year. Moving on, let's talk about A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown, of course, joined his best friend, quarterback Jalen Hurts, and they completely went off, elevating A.J. Brown to the level that we anticipated he could reach in a pass-heavy offense. Again, even though this team threw the ball, like the 25th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League last year, they still were able to get A.J. Brown to set career highs in targets, receptions, receiving yards, and fantasy points scored in a half PPR scoring format, averaging over 15 fantasy points per game last year, an incredible number that he'll hopefully be able to build upon this year. Moving on to Davante Adams. The fact of the matter is Davante Adams has finished as a top 3 wide receiver in fantasy football in 4 out of the last 5 seasons. The only year he wasn't able to, obviously, was because he dealt with an injury and was on the injured reserve for 4 games. He's quarterback proof. I truly do believe there is a opportunity for Jimmy Garoppolo to come in, and we're not going to see any sort of drop-off from Davante Adams. I'm hoping that's going to be the case, but Jimmy G at times can be a sketchy quarterback, so I have to go ahead and rank Davante Adams a little bit lower, not because his skill is being impacted, but rather, can the ball get there accurately and on time on a consistent basis from Jimmy Garoppolo. Moving on, let's talk about Amon-Ra St. Brown, one of the wide receivers that I really do love. Since week 13 of the 2021 season, in the last 20 healthy regular season games that Amon-Ra St. Brown has participated in 18 of those games, he has had 6 or more receptions, averaging 17.77 fantasy points per game. In an offense that has no other target competition, let's talk about the other receiving options. Sam Laporta, rookie tight end. Josh Reynolds, Marvin Jones Jr., and then, of course, you have Jahmyr Gibbs out of the backfield. But really, Jameson Williams, 6-game suspension. No one's competing for targets in this offense, and no one's slowing down Amon-Ra St. Brown. Moving on, let's talk about Garrett Wilson. We all saw that drive. We all saw what Aaron Rodgers and Garrett Wilson were able to produce within their first stint of that preseason, Game 3, where they annihilated the defense with that beautiful fade pass to the pylon. Perfectly on target, comes down with a touchdown. Incredible. I mean, we saw stints of time last season where Garrett Wilson was an incredible wide receiver, even though he was a rookie. with Joe Flacco or Mike White last season was averaging 14.23 fantasy points per game throughout the 8 games in which they were the starting quarterback, and it was not Zach Wilson. If you go ahead and add Aaron Rodgers to the conversation, there's a chance that Garrett Wilson could be in the level of CeeDee Lamb this upcoming season. It's very much so possible. There's even a possibility that he could even be better than him. When we look at the history of Aaron Rodgers' wide receiver ones since 2008, wide receivers associated with Aaron Rodgers as the number one of their offense targeted 131 times on average, leading to 86 receptions, 1,186 receiving yards, and 10 receiving touchdowns. Those numbers would be incredible for Garrett Wilson this year. Moving on to Jaylen Waddle. So here's the thing about Jaylen Waddle. As long as Tua Tagovailoa is healthy, he is going to be an unstoppable force, similar to Tyreek Hill. This is an offense that wants to throw the ball deep, and they consistently did that last season, and of course, allowed these receivers to make plays after the catch. When Tua was healthy last season in the 10 games in which he played with Jaylen Waddle was averaging 14.87 fantasy points per game. He could very easily get back into the conversation of being a top 12 wide receiver because offenses over the course of the last 5 years who have had 2 wide receivers in the top 12, those quarterbacks are averaging about 4,500 passing yards and 30 passing touchdowns. Very much so capable for Tua Tagovailoa in 2023. Moving on, let's talk about Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon, in my mind, again, the fact that there's zero backfield competition, the fact that this is an elite offense, they're going to find themselves in a lot of scoring scenarios. Since 2013, the last decade of football, running backs who have accumulated 200 plus rushing attempts and 60 plus receptions in a year. There have been 22 different running backs that have accomplished that since 2013. 18 of those 22 running backs have been top 5 in their season. The reason why I say there's a potential of Joe Mixon getting 60 plus receptions. Last season, he was on pace for 71 receptions in the year. And now there's no Samaje Perine to go ahead and dig into that receiving work. It leads to Joe Mixon absolutely, in my mind, being an RB1 this year. Moving on, let's talk about the first quarterback for today's video. It is Josh Allen. Josh Allen, again, had a very good opportunity, if it was not for the canceled Cincinnati Bengals game in week 17 of last year, of being the number 1 overall quarterback in fantasy football for 3 consecutive years. Again, no other quarterback in fantasy football history has had more 395 plus fantasy point seasons than Josh Allen. Of course, he's an automatic selection here. Now, another quarterback who I believe immediately should come off the board after him is, of course, the one and only Patrick Mahomes. The primary reason why is because when we talk about these elite level of quarterbacks, players that are able to reach 400 fantasy points, specifically, Patrick Mahomes has been able to accomplish that twice in his career. No other quarterback has been able to do that. When you're able to reach 400 points, the drop-off in production gives you such an advantage that taking Patrick Mahomes, a quarterback that has been top 4 in each of the last 3 seasons at the quarterback position, again, makes him an automatic draft selection at the end of the second round. Now, when we go into the conversation of Jalen Hurts, another one of these quarterbacks that, of course, finds himself a lot of success. Jalen Hurts last season, if it wasn't for the fact that he got injured, from weeks 1 through 15 was the number 1 overall quarterback in fantasy football in a 4-point per passing touchdown league, averaging 26.4 fantasy points per game. If he had stayed healthy and not missed a single game, would have finished as the QB1, would have been MVP. And again, even though he lost in the Super Bowl, you saw what he's capable of, what he can do in a singular game in a shootout. If there's more shootouts this year, man, Jalen Hurts could very easily be QB1. Moving on to Jonathan Taylor. Like I mentioned at the beginning of today's video, so in about 30 minutes from now, I'm anticipating that the Jonathan Taylor news will come out and we'll determine whether or not he is going to be traded or potentially placed on the PUP list. If he is traded to a team like the Miami Dolphins, he jumps into the C tier, if not better. If he is placed on the PUP list and he's going to miss at least the first 4 games of the season and then also miss the week 13 bye for the Indianapolis Colts. I think they have a week 13 bye. Maybe it's week 11. I forget. Either way, he's going to miss 5 games potentially for your fantasy team if you draft him. His ranking would be significantly lower. I'm going to leave him in the E tier because I don't know what the situation holds, but this is currently a decent spot if you're trying to take a gamble on him. We know what he's capable of. The guy's averaged 19.2 fantasy points per game in the last 3 seasons for the Indianapolis Colts. He's an elite level player. It's just as to whether or not he's going to be ready to play for this team or another team for 2023. Moving on to Calvin Ridley, the end of the E tier. Calvin Ridley, another one of these elite players of the wide receiver position. Last time he was active in 2020 for a full season, averaging 16.5 fantasy points per game in 14 games throughout that season. He joins Trevor Lawrence in an offense that is going to take steps forward with a quarterback that helped Christian Kirk, of all wide receivers, finish as the number 11 overall wide receiver in fantasy football last year. I'm expecting Calvin Ridley to be a top 12 player, and that's why I have him ranked in this position. Moving on, let's talk about the F tier. Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews is the only tight end that has been able to dethrone Travis Kelce for the number 1 overall ranking spot. Now that the Ravens have a pass-happy offensive coordinator with Todd Monken. Again, going back to 2018, he was the offensive coordinator of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They were top 5 in quarterback passing attempts, quarterback passing completions, quarterback passing yards, and passing touchdowns. So if we're going to implement that into this Ravens offense and let Lamar Jackson throw the ball to his primary number one target getter, Mark Andrews, then he should absolutely take massive steps forward in comparison to last year, if not be able to put together a season that is very similar to the year in which he dethroned Travis Kelce as the overall tight end one. Moving on, let's talk about Najee Harris. Again, many of you guys have been asking me in the last couple of days as we conducted a couple live streams at night. Again, I'll probably be live streaming tonight at 8 p.m. PST, so keep an eye out for that. Najee Harris reminds me of Melvin Gordon, Austin Ekeler from 2017, 2018. Jaylen Warren is going to be an active part of this offense on third down, and if that's going to be the case, it doesn't mean that Najee Harris's overall value is going to diminish. You got to remember, Najee Harris from week 6 through 18 after the injury was averaging 20 touches per game and 13.5 fantasy points per game, and was the number 12 overall running back in terms of a fantasy point per game average. Additionally, throughout that entire span of time for the entire 2022 year, there were 7 instances in which Najee Harris was tackled down at the 1 yard line, and then someone else scored a touchdown on the following play. There is going to be a potential uptick of points for Najee Harris this year, healthy, the primary goal line back, of course, capable of receiving work. Even with Jaylen Warren there, I still believe Najee Harris is a fantastic option. Moving on to T. Higgins. T. Higgins has the capabilities and has the opportunity to be a wide receiver one. All he has to do is stay healthy. Last season, in the full games he played, he was averaging 13.86 fantasy points per game, which was better than the numbers I just mentioned for Najee Harris. So very easily can be a better overall fantasy prospect in that overall regard, especially considering the 3 games in which he was injured last year, played 1% of the snaps, 15% of the snaps, and 26% of the snaps. If, in fact, we can clean that up, have a full healthy season, he was on pace for finishing as wide receiver 7 last year, which would have him far higher than the current F tier. Moving on, let's talk about DeVonta Smith. DeVonta Smith purely just needs this offense to be in more shootouts, because if in fact that's going to be the case, he'll be able to compete with targets with guys like A.J. Brown, and of course repeat a season in which he had 90 receptions last year, a boatload of receiving yards, and if he's able to duplicate those receiving touchdown numbers, incredible. Being able to produce 2 top 12 wide receivers, similar to the way that this team did last year, is very difficult. Specifically, the Eagles quarterbacks combined for nearly 4,400 passing yards and 25 passing touchdowns last year. The typical average over the course of the last 5 seasons is about 4,500 passing yards and 30 passing touchdowns. So if you attribute those touchdowns to the receivers properly, and DeVonta Smith's going to come back with 9, 10 receiving touchdowns this year, obviously he'll be a wide receiver 1, but I'm expecting regression in that category. Moving on, let's talk about Travis Etienne. I understand that Tank Bigsby is going to be in this offense. He was drafted to come in here and play that RB2 role, but that's exactly what he is. He's the RB2 of this offense. Etienne is the number 1, and when he's been the number 1 of this offense, averaging 18.6 touches per game and 13.6 fantasy points per game last year in terms of efficiency at the running back position on the ground, he was number 3 amongst all running backs with a minimum of 175 rushing attempts last year. Again, there were 31 running backs within that category. He averaged 5.11 yards per attempt. That kind of number hopefully will repeat once again this year within this offense. Moving on to Aaron Jones. Speaking of efficiency at the running back position, amongst all running backs with 175 rushing attempts last season, Aaron Jones had the highest yard per carry average. Hopefully he'll be able to repeat that this year, not only on the ground, but through the air, his efficiencies, as he's been the number 2 target getter and reception leader of the Green Bay Packers since 2019. Throughout that span of time since 2019, has always been a top 12 running back for half PPR scoring formats. We're hoping for the same this year, even regardless of the fact that Aaron Rodgers is no longer within this offense. Moving on, DK Metcalf. DK Metcalf, again, just needs touchdowns and it's over. And his whole season could very easily get him into that top 12 conversation. That is the only thing that, in terms of his overall statistics, he was not able to achieve last year at an elite level. In comparison, he set career highs in targets and receptions, had over 90 receptions last season, of course, had over 1,000 receiving yards, but was number 3 amongst all receiving options in red zone targets, had a total of 27. He had a 40% target share within the red zone within this offense, but it only led to 5 receiving touchdowns. If that number increases to 8 receiving touchdowns in the end zone, if not 10, potentially this year, DK Metcalf absolutely will become a wide receiver 1. That's his upside. Otherwise, he sits in this wide receiver 2 conversation with a lot of potential help from Geno Smith going in his direction. Moving on, let's talk about Jahmyr Gibbs. Jahmyr Gibbs could very easily be the Alvin Kamara of this season. When we talk about where he was drafted, 12th overall, the history of running backs at that overall position, averaging 250 fantasy points in that given year within only a 16-game season, we're expecting Jahmyr Gibbs to be in that conversation primarily because we know that Dan Campbell, the head coach of this organization, comes from the Sean Payton coaching tree. Dan Campbell was the tight ends coach of the New Orleans Saints back in 2017 when Alvin Kamara was a rookie. Him and Mark Ingram dominated. Both of them were RB1s in that given year. I'm expecting a lot of receptions to go in the direction of Jahmyr Gibbs, primarily because outside of Amon-Ra St. Brown, no one in this offense is going to catch the ball more than Jahmyr Gibbs. If he catches the ball 70 times this year, similar to numbers that we have seen from guys like Alvin Kamara in seasons past, he will absolutely be worth the overall selection here. Moving on. Let's talk about Chris Olave, another one of these players that very easily could outproduce his current ranking, considering who he's associated with. The fact that he's in the New Orleans Saints offense and Derek Carr is their current starting quarterback in the last 3 seasons. Derek Carr has helped create the number 8 overall wide receiver, the number 11 overall wide receiver, and the number 3 overall wide receiver in terms of total fantasy points scored. Even though one of those years was with Darren Waller, if you take his fantasy point total and make him into a wide receiver, he was wide receiver 8 that year. We're talking about 3 seasons of having a receiver with a minimum of 100 receptions total within that given year. Waller with 107, Renfrow with 103, and Adams last year with 100. I'm expecting Chris Olave to be the number 1 of this offense, and hopefully, if he's up for the task at hand, dominate and get himself into this conversation to perhaps getting 100 receptions. If he can, he absolutely blows out this overall current ranking. If he's able to do so, he will absolutely put this current ranking to shame within the top 50. But that being said, there is a potential that he doesn't catch as many passes because there are so many other looming threats within this offense, whether it's Kamara, Jamal Williams, Taysom Hill, Mike Thomas, we have Rashid Shaheed, Jimmy Graham, Jawan Johnson, Foster Moreau. A lot of mouths to feed within this offense, but if Olave is number 1, we're hoping for upside. Moving on, let's talk about Miles Sanders. He's joining an offense that needs a 3-down back, and they need to run the ball. Frank Reich, of course, he was a former Indianapolis Colts head coach. They ran the ball the most amongst all teams in the National Football League since 2018, since he took over the job there. Additionally, they have Deuce Staley as their running backs coach. He was the former running backs coach of the Philadelphia Eagles when Miles Sanders was there for his first 2 seasons. Miles Sanders was targeted 62 times and 53 times in those given years. So if he's going to be the 3-down back of this organization and be given 15 opportunities per game, since 2018, Miles Sanders is averaging 14.89 fantasy points per game in those instances. We're hoping for a lot of that this year. Moving on to Rhamondre Stevenson. I understand there is some risk implied with Ezekiel Elliott being in this offense, but understand in games since 2021 in which Rhamondre Stevenson has been given 15 or more touches, he's averaging 16 fantasy points per game. And even if, in fact, Zeke Elliott impacts his overall rushing work, the efficiency that Rhamondre Stevenson presented last season in terms of yards after contact, yards per carry, they're very reminiscent of what we saw from Tony Pollard last year. We can see Rhamondre Stevenson absolutely get into this RB2 conversation, if not better, even though Zeke is going to be present and they're on the goal line. Because what Rhamondre Stevenson was able to do last season in the receiving game, number 3 in terms of total targets amongst all running backs, number 4 in receptions, number 7 in receiving yards, and number 9 in routes run, that is what is the biggest difference maker and what's going to elevate his game in 2023. Moving on, let's talk about Alexander Mattison. He's taking up the role of Dalvin Cook, a running back that is ranked number 15 or better at the running back position over the course of the last 4 seasons. In my opinion, when we look at the potential of what Alexander presents, specifically in the games he has played, the 6 starts of his career, averaging 19.5 touches per game and 18.13 fantasy points per game. The fact that he's behind the highest graded run blocking offensive line going into 2023, additionally has the easiest strength of schedule at the running back position. In an offense that loves to use play action, they're going to have to get the running game established for Kirk Cousins with Alexander Mattison in order for this offense to succeed. Moving on, let's talk about Lamar Jackson. Similar to the way that we talked about with Mark Andrews, if in fact Todd Monken's going to come in and really elevate this offense, again, like I mentioned, they were top 5 in quarterback attempts, passing yards, passing touchdowns, passing completions. If they elevate Lamar Jackson to throw the ball even more, I mean, over the course of the last 3 seasons, averaging 21.8 fantasy points per game. If we can get anything upticked upon those overall contributions, the fact that you have Zay Flowers and of course Odell Beckham joining this offense, I'm expecting his overall numbers not only just through the air, but of course on the ground to increase going into 2023. Moving on, let's talk about Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen, when healthy last season, weeks 11 through 18, averaged over 15 fantasy points per game. Since 2020, since Justin Herbert has taken over the starting job of this offense in the last 35 regular season games, Keenan Allen is averaging 14.36 fantasy points per game. His level of consistency is unbelievable, especially going into the season where he'll be 31 years old. Keenan Allen has a lot to prove, but still a lot of consistency. That's the reason why we're drafting him as high as we currently are. Moving on to Justin Fields. Justin Fields was the number 3 overall quarterback in NFL history to surpass 1,000 rushing yards in a given season. From weeks 5 through 17 of last year, averaged nearly 24 fantasy points per game. If you were to expand it upon a full 17-game season, we're talking about the level at which Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, and of course Jalen Hurts can reach. If Justin Fields can elevate the passing game, continue his success on the ground with bringing in guys like Robert Tonyan, you have another year with Chase Claypool, and of course bringing in the stud receiver DJ Moore, the elevation of his overall production could get him into a far better standing than where he currently sits. Moving on to Amari Cooper. Any wide receiver one that has ever been associated with Deshaun Watson has found success, whether it's been DeAndre Hopkins from 2017 through 2019, averaging 16.3 fantasy points per game, whether it's been Will Fuller from 2017 through 2020, averaging 20.25 fantasy points per game. That will need to be studied for fantasy football history. Will Fuller was a special receiver when healthy. It was unbelievable. And even in 2020, Brandon Cooks, after Will Fuller's suspension from weeks 5 through 17, averaging nearly 16 fantasy points per game. Even though Amari Cooper set career highs in targets, receiving touchdowns, and fantasy points last season, we're hoping for similar levels of production and opportunity this year. Moving on to David Montgomery. Like I've mentioned in the past, and I'll continue to say it, Dan Campbell has already come out and said this offseason, when push comes to shove, we need a running back that we can trust giving the ball to 20 to 25 times in a singular game. And that's what we have with David Montgomery. And then we need someone to be a scalpel in this offense. We need someone to slice up defenses in the receiving game. That is Jahmyr Gibbs. If David Montgomery is being brought in, and not if, David Montgomery is being brought in to beat Jamal Williams. Jamal Williams finished as RB8 overall last season because of the fact that he had 250 plus rushing attempts, over 1,000 rushing yards, and 17 rushing touchdowns, broke Barry Sanders' rushing touchdown record for that organization, only playing 40% of the offensive snaps. They're going to give him the ball in the red zone. Is he going to score 17 touchdowns? Absolutely not. But is he going to be enough of a role player and get enough fantasy points to be relevant behind one of the best offensive lines and one of the easiest strength of schedule at the running back position this year? Absolutely. Therefore, David Montgomery sits in this H-tier conversation. Moving on. Let's talk about Mike Williams. Even though he has been inconsistent in his career, the fact of the matter is Mike Williams presents so much upside that you have to take a risk on him. Even though he's dealt with injuries and he's inconsistent, when he hits, he hits. I mean, this is a wide receiver that last season, from weeks 1 through 7, was averaging 12.3 fantasy points per game. And then even when he came back from injury, was averaging 12.95 fantasy points per game. In an offense that gets a brand new offensive coordinator, healthy offensive line, healthy Mike Williams and Keenan Allen, and a healthy Justin Herbert, I'm expecting a lot of production for Mike Williams. Moving on, let's talk about Kenneth Walker. Kenneth Walker, again, from weeks 5 through the playoffs of last season, after Rashad Penny's injury, was averaging 20.58 touches per game and 15.69 fantasy points per game. Then they go ahead and they make the second-round selection of Zach Charbonnet. He's going to come in and make an impact, especially considering this team only ran the ball with their running backs 350 times last season. If you take 21 touches per game and expand that upon a 17-game season, there will not be enough touches for both Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet to coexist. So if they dig into each other's work, that is absolutely the reason why Kenneth Walker is lower in my overall rankings, because I expect Zach Charbonnet to come in and make an impact immediately within this offense, certainly hurting Kenneth Walker's overall upside, but still his baseline of production should be very similar to last season. Moving on, let's talk about Deebo Samuel. I liken Deebo Samuel to Two-Face Harvey Dent because sometimes for a fantasy purposes, he can be the upside player like in 2021 who scores 300 fantasy points in a given year, or he can be the downside player who gets injured, misses a lot of time, and is the wide receiver 36 in a season. I'm hoping for the middle. I'm hoping for the healthy upside / downside mixture of being a wide receiver 2. Someone that, yes, is going to have the explosive weeks of being a 20-point player, but also is going to be consistent enough to get, 10 points a week minimum. There are going to be some, overall inconsistencies, ebbs and flows with his overall play, considering how many mouths there are to feed within that offense. But at least we know that the upside is certainly worth taking the risk on. Moving on to Christian Watson. Speaking of risky upside, Christian Watson from weeks 10 through 18 of last year was one of the best wide receivers. In fact, was number 7 overall throughout that span of time, averaging 15.24 fantasy points per game. The fact that he was able to score 143 fantasy points with only 66 total targets, I mean, again, had a 24.44% target share within this offense, had a 2.26 yards per route run average. These are ridiculous numbers. Within an offense that has 244 targets vacated with Cobb, Lazard, Lewis, and Tunyon out, there should be a lot of opportunity for Christian Watson to be the number 1 receiving option of this offense. Probably will see regression in terms of his touchdowns, but that won't matter as his receptions and yards continue to climb upwards for fantasy purposes. Moving on to Breece Hall. Breece Hall, again, we know how good he is. I don't have to express that to you. You know the kind of damage he was doing early last season. The fact of the matter is, Breece Hall, in order to maintain where I have him currently ranked for fantasy purposes, he cannot get injured. He cannot miss time this year. When you compare him to other running backs over the course of the last decade who have had ACL injuries and in their first year back from that ACL injury have found struggles to be able to produce similar fantasy numbers, it often has to do with the fact that those running backs ran into injuries. Dalvin Cook was RB29. Saquon Barkley, RB32. J.K. Dobbins, RB52. All of those scenarios in which we had elite running backs the year prior and then the year after came back and they were not the same had to do with the fact that they all missed significant time in their first year back from that injury. Typically, you'll find a lot more success in that second year back from the injury, but we're going to go ahead and take the risk on Breece Hall this year and hope for his potential upside. The final two players begins with TJ Hawkinson. We're talking about a receiving option that as soon as he joined the Minnesota Vikings was targeted 1 out of every 4 routes that he ran. I mean, specifically, in the 11 games he played, including the playoffs, he was targeted 8 times in 8 of those 11 games. I mean, 8 or more times is ridiculous in a single game, especially for a tight end. Those are numbers very reminiscent of what we have seen Travis Kelce produce with Patrick Mahomes. So if we go ahead and implement him in this offense, averaging 12.2 fantasy points per game last year with the Minnesota Vikings throughout that 11-game span, and you go ahead and continue to build upon it without Irv Smith in this lineup or Adam Thielen, I'm expecting a lot of production from TJ Hawkins. And the final player I wanted to mention is DeAndre Hopkins, a guy that from week 7 through 14 of last year, prior to leaving from injury and after coming back from the suspension, DeAndre Hopkins was incredible, averaging nearly 11 targets per game, 8 receptions per game, 93 receiving yards, 15.61 fantasy points per game. Joining an offense with 200 targets being vacated, I'm expecting for DeAndre Hopkins to be a very good option within this offense with Ryan Tannehill healthy. Again, he was able to support A.J. Brown being a top 15 wide receiver in 2019 and a top 11 overall wide receiver in 2020. Hoping for that this upcoming season for DeAndre Hopkins. But again, he's getting older, and this is a run-first attack, so maybe he doesn't get to those overall numbers, but a wide receiver 2 standing would be incredible. All right, that's going to cover for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Those are my top 50 flex rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. If you enjoyed today's content, be sure to subscribe, click the like button down below. Again, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season with the singular goal of trying to help you guys win a fantasy football championship. I said that this video was going to be shorter, but to be honest, I just like to talk, so I tried my very best. Hopefully you guys enjoyed today's content. Do not forget, if you guys have not yet already, be sure to travel down to the description of the video. Head on over to andrewkirchhoffshop.com where you can go ahead, support the channel, and rep greetings and salutations with the 1.01 brand. Greatly appreciate that. Additionally, for those of you who want rankings all season long, from my email to yours, my draft guide, and the ability to draft on Underdog, gain experience, all you got to do today is travel down to the description of the video and head on over to Underdog Fantasy. Use code Andrew, make that first-time deposit minimum of $10, and get my help for the entirety of the 2023 year so we can help you capture a 2023 fantasy football championship. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.